there have been plenty of studies that examine, for every dollar of government spending on different things, how many jobs are actually created. So, for example, if the government hires people to do things, obviously every dollar of government spending like that is job friendly, creates a job. Watching the suicide of the socialist parties of Europe. They are committing political suicide.
Okay.
And I can explain how that is and why that is.
All right.
And I think it goes to the questions you're asking. But I don't know if you want to do that.
Not right now because we're way out of sequence. Maybe as the interview continues, I can come back to your.
As you like.
Yeah. Yeah. Testing one, two, three. And the weapons industry is perhaps a singular example of how the public subsidizes private corporations.
Not only does the United States want, seek, and maintain a monopoly of the most advanced military weapons in the world, but it also markets a huge amount of weapons to the rest of the world on a regular basis. Let me explain the economics of this. The government insists on being the monopolizer of these weapons. In other words, it says to the companies that produce advanced aircraft, advanced missiles, advanced technology to control and manipulate all of these, that it must be the only purchaser, it must be the only owner. That puts on these corporations a peculiar situation. They're supposed to make immense investments to build up the capacity to make these things, faced with only one possible buyer. That's not the usual situation a corporation faces. And so, in order for this to work, the government basically has to guarantee the payoff to all of these investments, which it does. Sometimes this is called a cost plus contract, where what basically is done is the company submits to the government the cost of whatever it is it did, and the government agrees in advance to pay them that money plus 10% or whatever it is as a profit. What this does is it creates extraordinary profit opportunities. Corporations are effectively being removed from any risk. Unlike other corporations who try to estimate the market and make an investment and hope it works, none of that's necessary for a military producer because he's not going to go into the business unless the government guarantees it. And the way you guarantee it is to give them a ton of money, basically promised up front. And where does that money come from? The average American person. So that, of course, the taxes of the United States are subsidizing the producers of this military equipment in this country on a massive scale. Periodically, it leaks out that, for example, an invoice for a toilet seat is $300 and you can buy the exact same thing at your local hardware store for $11, etc. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Even when there isn't phony invoicing, what you have here is basically a vast government slush fund that is rolling into the coffers of the defense producers, who therefore are rolling in profits, who can therefore hire people and make the payments that make the local communities very grateful for them to be there because they're in a unique, special, comfy, close intimacy with the government. And so when Eisenhower said military industrial complex, even he didn't understand how massive and how special and how burdensome on everybody this kind of institution is. When the Cold War came to an end with the implosion of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, there was much talk, I'm talking now the early 1990s, there was much talk of something called then a peace dividend. It never happened. All the money that we didn't need anymore because the only other superpower outside the United States was the Soviet Union, and it was no longer our enemy, and it was dismantling most of its military capability, and it was in economic distress. It couldn't afford a war in any case. Despite all of that, it was proved impossible in the United States for the social forces that demanded a peace dividend to get their way. Could they have won a peace dividend? Sure. Might there have been a decision to dismantle our military to just the amount needed to be a defense in the modern world against a world that had no other superpower? Sure, but there would have had to be a mass movement to make that happen. There wasn't one, so it didn't happen. So I think Occupy Wall Street folks have to face the fact that the only way that's going to happen is if they become the powerful social movement that didn't exist in the 1990s and that might make that happen. And let me add another point. We have had a dominant military, enormous institution in this country now for the 50 years roughly since the end of World War II. That has produced concentrations of wealth and influence wherever military production occurs, wherever big military bases are located. We're going to have to organize the dismantling of this so that the people involved do not lose their jobs, their homes, their communities, because we have to have an orderly way to reorganize production. There's going to have to be a lot of planning to make this happen in a way that's respectful of people's needs, rather than some summary shift from A to B, which will leave vast parts of this country bereft. And we have to let them know that the rest of us care enough about them so that they do not have to become supporters of a continued military program out of the misguided idea that there's no other way to guarantee them a decent job and a decent income. They can get those things, but that would have to be the result of a planned demobilization of the sort we wanted to have at the end of World War II. We wanted again to have at the end of the Cold War in the late 1980s, and that we can have it, but we have to have the political movement to realize it. Yes, I've been saying a lot in my public speeches recently that we as a nation, we Americans, are rightfully proud that periodically we subject certain of our institutions to debate and criticism, with the idea being we can make them better. For example, we are a nation obsessed with criticizing schools and education. Are they working? Are they not working? Should they have a different curriculum? Should they be organized in a different way? And we periodically reform and revise our educational system. We do the same with our transportation system. Last year, we debated for an entire year about our health and health insurance systems. That's good. You need to debate your institutions by saying always, are they working? Do they serve the public that they're supposed to serve? And if they're not, can we fix them? And if they're beyond being fixed, can we replace them with a better system? For 50 years, we have not done that with our economic system. All we ever said about capitalism as a nation was how wonderful it was. That's not debate. That's not criticism. That's a failure of nerve to ask the questions that an economic system needs just as much as an education, transportation, or health system. But we were caught up in the Cold War. We were caught up in anti-communism. To question capitalism was thought to be somehow disloyal, and so we never did. So behind the veneer of a need to celebrate where we ought to have been critical, our capitalism got more and more out of whack. It benefited a fewer and fewer number of people at the expense of the rest of us, and we're now living out the consequences. We ought to learn our lesson. Words like planning shouldn't be taboo. Words like capitalism should not be taboo. That's an institution like any other. We ought to ask, does capitalism work for us? Maybe it did in the past. That doesn't guarantee it's going to do it now or in the future. I think Occupy Wall Street is finding its way and doing an enormous service to the United States by finally reopening the question and saying, hey, a capitalist system that puts everything in the hands of 1% at the expense of 99% is a system that at the very least needs criticism, debate, and the fundamental question, can we do better as a nation than capitalism? Yes, one of the things I've always taught in my classes is that this notion that we can distinguish the private sector from the public sector is one of the founding myths of right-wing ways of thinking and ought to be exploded. The dependence of the private sector on the public sector is at every turn fundamental. Let me just give you two examples to drive it home. Everything in this country turns on money. How much money is there? Who makes the money? Let me remind everyone, We put into jail anybody in the private sector who makes money. That's against the law. Money is the monopoly activity of the government. The government sits around, decides how many dollar bills to produce, how many quarters to mint and to circulate. So this economy depends on money means it depends on institutions and decisions that are exclusively in the public sector. Let me give you a second example. Today in the United States, there are roughly 15 million people who go to colleges and universities. That's our population. Out of that, less than 3 million go to private schools. 12 plus million, the overwhelming majority of young people with college training, get that training in and by the public institutions of our country. Nothing is more crucial to the success and future of America's private enterprises than the skilled workers the public pays to train and educate it. So who's dependent on who here is childish. The interpenetration of public and private has always been so fundamental that the exercise of crediting the private sector with what's positive and blaming the public sector with what's negative is absurd. It's not even a question of arguing against it. It's silly. It misunderstands the way our economy works. And the public has every right to say, since we pay, for example, for the overwhelming bulk of the educated working class in this country, upon which all private industry depends, we ought to have a say in what is done with the profits earned by the private industry, because it couldn't earn those profits without the publicly funded education provided to the core of the people working there. That would be a perfectly logical, reasonable demand, but in the ideology of public and private as it works in the United States, no one even thinks of it. The government goes in and literally announces, we're taking, and I'll use the financial language now, the toxic assets, that's what they call them, these collapsed asset-backed securities. We're taking the toxic assets off the balance sheets of the banks. Okay, now let me translate that into English. The bad debts the bad investments they made, which they are paid not to make, the government relieved them of. Gave them money instead, new fresh government money, gave them loans at very advantageous rates, and made the government, i.e. the people, the owners of risky assets, whereas the banks got instead cash money with no risk attached. Hello, that's a handout. That's welfare. But it's the only difference between that and the welfare for a poor family is much more money was involved. And what do we say? We say nothing as a nation. We think this is somehow necessary. And now all we're debating is how big the cuts are the rest of us should take to finance that hustle.